Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to this course on boundaries, moving from battles to boundaries, moving from conflict to connection. So welcome everyone. I am Susie Lula, so grateful to have you all. Just taking a few moments while everyone is gathering. You might want to grab a journal, a cup of tea, maybe light a candle. So good to have everyone. Hi, welcome Lindsay and Marit. Glad to have you. It's going to be a wonderful class to really anchor us in our own sovereignty, our own sovereign being, and then learn how to create effective boundaries to best connect with others. You know, boundaries often end up disconnecting us from others. So this class is about setting boundaries so that we can be more intimately connected with others and those around us. So welcome as we're gathering. Welcome, Elena and Swati, Alejandra, Jacqueline, so nice to see you. So nice to see you all. I'll just take a nice deep breath while others are coming. Remember, there is nothing more important. There's no way that's more important for you to invest your time and your energy than on your own being, your own inner peace. That which brings you the inner peace will then overflow and affect every relationship in your outer life. Welcome, everyone. So, welcome to this boundaries, connection, from battles to boundary, from conflict to connection course. And today that is what we are going to be working with, this way that boundaries, even with the best intentions, can end up having us feeling disconnected from the other individual feeling disconnected from us. And today we're going to talk about how to set effective boundaries so that you can actually bring more connection and more intimacy into your life, you know. So boundaries and learning to set effective boundaries is actually one of the highest spiritual practices, one of the highest evolutionary practices that we can participate in, that we can learn on our journey, because it teaches us how to be whole. It teaches us that we are sovereign beings, that we are individuals, whole and complete as we are, and simultaneously that we are interdependent with all of those around us. We're not codependent. We're seeking not to be enmeshed with others. We are seeking to recognize that we are each full-on, whole, complete individuals, interdependent with those around us. So let's start with, what is the definition of a boundary? You know, a boundary is a limit. And as I was saying, that limit can often ultimately end up having us feel and the other feel disconnected, rather than this effective limit enhancing our relationship with the other individual. So this is what we're going to be talking with today. When we think about a limit, when we think about a boundary, we're usually thinking about the other person. What we're going to work with today is that effective boundaries are really for us and against no one else, nothing else. So begin to, as we're going through the class, begin to recognize that setting a boundary is ultimately about you. And begin to ask, how can this setting of this boundary be for me? So what we usually call a boundary is really all about compliance. We're calling it a boundary, but what we really are seeking is for the other individual to comply with that boundary. So we're actually looking for compliance rather than simply holding a limit. This is really important. So again, as we're going through the class today, I want you to begin to bring just your own real life examples into the class. And I'm going to be talking about real life examples from my life. And begin to unravel that what you might be calling a boundary is really that you are looking to another individual to comply with your need. I'm going to help us unravel this so that we can really learn to set effective boundaries that engender cooperation. And there's a difference between cooperation and compliance. When you recognize that this limit is actually for yourself and not about the other person, and when you recognize that your own learning here is about creating neutrality within yourself, because think about it, you ask your toddler, please put a toy down, and rather than putting the toy down, they throw the toy at you. Depending on where you are inside of yourself is going to determine whether you end up getting into a conflict and a battle, or whether you are able to hold the neutrality inside of yourself if said toddler doesn't comply with said boundary. So there's two parts to setting effective boundaries. The first part is about clarity inwardly. The first part is about creating inner clarity. We're going to be talking today about how many of us, most of us, are very confused about boundaries. And the inner confusion is part of what elicits the outer non-compliance. So the first part of setting a boundary, and there's two parts, is about inner clarity, clearing up inner confusion, cultivating that inner clarity. And the second part about setting effective boundaries is about cultivating your own neutrality when the other person doesn't comply. So when another person doesn't comply with the limit that you set, you are either going to be able to hold in neutrality or you yourself will be triggered. So this is the second part, because if you are triggered, you will create a battle. You will create a power struggle. You will create a conflict. But remember, it takes two people to have a battle. When one is in neutrality and the other is upset, there will be no battle. So we're going to dive in to the first part today. The first part of setting effective boundaries is about cultivating our own inner clarity. So we as a culture are very confused about boundary setting. We as a culture have been taught so many misperceptions about setting boundaries. And from our own family of origin, we have received so many misperceptions about setting effective boundaries. So we end up confused. So I'm going to go over some of the misperceptions that you might have been taught as either a culture or from your own family. So we are taught, especially as women, don't speak up for yourself. Don't even have a boundary in the first place. Be a good girl. Be a nice girl. Be a compliant girl. Be compliant. That's why we go crazy when our spouse or our partner or our friend or our toddler doesn't comply. Because we are in essence saying, I've been taught to comply and I abandon myself and I comply. Why aren't you complying? You should be meeting the same rules that I meet. Inside, we're really raging that the other person isn't being compliant because we are being compliant. That we are taught from culture. Then we end up being passive aggressive. We end up not saying what we really mean because we've been taught don't even have the boundary in the first place. Don't have a voice for yourself. Don't speak up. Be compliant. Be good. Be nice. So we aren't taught that absolutely you should have your own voice, take up your own space. And so we need these passive aggressive ways to end up trying to meet our need, to be self-expressed and have our limits and our boundaries. This is part of the inner confusion that ends up creating outer conflict. Inner confusion is going to create outer conflict. You can't have inner confusion and outer peace. You can't have inner peace and outer conflict. Some of the other boundaries and misperceptions about boundaries that we're taught is that the other person should comply with what we want, because that's what we've been taught to do. We're taught to avoid conflicts at all costs. So we're afraid of even setting a boundary in case there's a conflict that comes back, because we don't know how to handle conflict effectively. We don't know how to stay neutral when someone else has big feelings. Just think about that for a moment. Think about your spouse. Think about a toddler. Think about a teenager. Think about a friend. You set a boundary. They have big reaction to your boundary. We haven't been taught to stay neutral, to stay at peace, to stay even joyful and in our resplendent glory, and allow the other person to have a big reaction. That right there is a course. That right there is a liberated life. We're also taught, don't ask for assistance. That asking for assistance, asking for help, we're taught that it's weak, that we should be able to do everything. We're taught to do everything for ourselves. We're taught to put the other individuals first before us. We're taught to put ourselves last on our own list. And then when someone else doesn't comply with our limit, we get upset. We get upset. And in essence, what we're saying is that I've been abandoning myself. I haven't been listening to my own needs. I've been putting myself last on the list. Why aren't you complying? Why aren't you doing the same? Why aren't you abandoning yourself in favor of my boundary? So this is all very confused. And then what we end up in our outer life is conflict. We end up, head to head with the other individual. So we tend to set boundaries on how boundaries were set for us. And we tend to set boundaries not only for how culture has taught us messages, but also our own family of origin. So we often end up setting a boundary the same way that boundaries were set in our own home, or we end up rebelling against that and setting boundaries in exactly the opposite way that boundaries were set in our own family of origin, because most of us grew up with the misperception, but with the experience that boundaries are punitive. And so we're very confused about the difference between a boundary and punishment, boundaries and punitive actions. So boundaries are neutral, as I'm going to be showing you today, and punishment is not neutral. I guess the difference is in the inner neutrality. So we are conflicted inside, and then we end up having an outer conflict because we haven't given ourselves permission to have a voice for ourselves in the first place. We haven't learned how to deal with conflict in the first place. We're expecting the other person to comply with us in the first place. So the first thing we need to do is to become aware of what is the confusion within us, right? Because we're always teaching people how to treat us. And if we're inwardly confused, we're going to create such a different outer result than if we take the time to come to clarity. When I am clear in setting a boundary, it's going to be so different than if I'm confused about setting the same boundary. So I want you to begin to think of your own life. Think of real examples in your own life around trying and practicing to set effective boundaries. And in the chat box, I want you to answer this question. What is your confusion? What is your challenge about setting boundaries based on the misbeliefs that you might have heard growing up? So what is your confusion around setting boundaries. Adrienne is saying, giving herself the permission to allow herself to have boundaries in the first place is huge. This right here is the course of a lifetime, to give yourself permission to have boundaries in the first place and then clear up the inner confusion. So beautiful. So beautiful, beautiful. So just share in the chat box, what are you confused about where setting boundaries? This is the first step. Have a hard time not people pleasing. We're going to talk about this. And I tend to let it go to the point that I can't take it anymore, and then I explode. Excellent. So I'm going to talk about taking ownership of this. Learning how to take ownership of that right there is going to help liberate you. That's excellent. The expectation to say yes from the other person. How to set a boundary while respecting ours as well as the other person's autonomy. We're going to be talking exactly about that. That brings up a lot of confusion for us. My confusion around setting boundaries is that I will be abused or alone if I have any boundaries. This is very common. We fear that we are going to be abused or alone. Why? Because when we try to set boundaries for ourselves as children, what happened? I know this happened in my family. When I tried to have a voice for myself, my mom would leave the room. If my mom didn't like what I had to say, she just left. It was just the way they parented at the time. Children are to be seen, but not heard. So we have to work with this fear that comes with setting boundaries, that I might be alone, that someone might walk away from us, and someone might walk away from you. But when you learn how to be present with this, which we're going to be talking about today, then you're going to have the liberation to still set the boundary and allow the other person to have their own reaction. That's very good. I shrink when I think about it. This is so common to so many of us. Even thinking about setting the boundary has us shrink. And so then if we do dare to actually set a boundary, the inner energy that comes with it is this inner shrinking. And so the inner shrinking is sending a confusing message to the other individual. Because remember, one of my favorite quotes is the Maya Angelou quote. People are not going to remember what we say, but people are going to remember how we make them feel. So we don't realize it, but we go to set a boundary and we're sending mixed messages. I'm setting this boundary, but I'm shrinking. I'm setting this boundary and I expect you not to abandon me. I expect you to comply. I'm setting this boundary, but I'm really scared. We're sending a lot of confusing mixed messages. So it's very important to become aware of which messages you are sending. When you become aware of the messages that you're sending, then you can become in dominion of clarifying your inner life. And when you clarify your inner life, you're going to be setting more effective boundaries. Okay, Cecilia is saying that she's not sure what exactly boundaries mean when pertaining to children. So yes, I am going to give you many examples today of examples from my own life. I have a teenager, so I have examples from the time he was 3 to the time that he's 13. And I'm going to be reading a couple of questions that people have sent me, and one of them has specifically to do with children. We are very confused where boundaries are concerned around children. So let's just sit for a moment, take a nice deep breath in and exhale. So the first step is to recognize that we are confused about boundaries. And just stating the confusion is going to allow us to take the next step towards cultivating our inner clarity. So for myself, I have always been very, what would be the word? I've been very mindful, I guess is the word, around setting boundaries with my son. I've been very careful, I think. So I'm going to use a couple of examples from my own life with my son, but if you're watching and you don't have children, you think about a friend, you think about a coworker, you think about, a spouse, a partner, a girlfriend, because this might have to do with a toddler or a teen, but it really applies universally to setting boundaries. So the first thing that I always do before I choose to set a boundary, and as I said, I choose to set boundaries very carefully with my son. I've done that since the time he was 2 to now he's 15. I'm very careful about the boundary in the first place. I did a lot of unpacking because I was raised in a very dysfunctional, disempowering family. And so I did a lot of inner work when I wasn't around my child. That's why I think that this class today and the upcoming 4-week class that I'm teaching is going to be so powering and empowering for everyone, because you need the time to unpack what is making you confused in order to elicit real cooperation and not just compliance or resistance. We either get compliance or we get conflict. Neither one of them is really creating healthy intimacy and healthy connection. So I was always careful and am always careful about setting boundaries. And I always ask myself, am I looking for compliance with this boundary? So if I have my toddler, let's say 3, and he's throwing a toy at me, am I looking for compliance? Am I looking for him to stop throwing that toy so that I become more relaxed? Am I looking for him to stop throwing that toy so that I don't feel so anxious? Am I looking for him to stop throwing that toy so that I alleviate my fear that he's going to turn out to be a mean-spirited boy and he's not going to learn how to be nice and be respectful? This is where a lot of confusion comes in. We go into an either or duality. Because, of course, we're all going to say that we're justified because, of course, no one would want their toddler to throw a toy. What you need to understand is it isn't the boundary. The boundary, asking your child not to throw a toy, is actually neutral, but whatever energy you are bringing into the situation is going to color their response. So if I am anxious when my son throws a toy or my son pulls another child's hair, if I'm anxious, it doesn't mean I'm not going to set the boundary. We always go into an either or, then I shouldn't set the boundary. It doesn't mean I'm not going to set the boundary, but I need to be aware that I'm bringing in energy into this boundary setting unless I have the moment to go work my own process and come in clean. So either I ask the child to put the toy down and either I'm clean, I have no anxiety, I'm neutral, and I'm asking them to put that toy down because they're going to hurt someone, or I'm coming in and I'm bringing in my own anxiety and fears. And it's very important to have the discernment and the distinction of knowing what energy you are bringing into this relationship. Therein lies your liberation or your imprisonment. So let's say when my son was, 3, 4, 5, around that age when a lot of you have conflict with things like brushing teeth in the evening, eating dinner, throwing toys, all of these. I would always get clear on myself. And if I knew that I was going to be bringing in exhausted energy, anxious energy, needing compliance, any of that kind of fearful energy, lacking energy, I was already exhausted. I was already feeling overwhelmed. If I was bringing any of that into this boundary setting, more often than not, I would forego the boundary in the first place. So then people are going to say, what, you didn't have your son brush his teeth that night? What, you didn't have him eat his vegetables that night? He's going to learn to run amok. He's going to learn to not be compliant. This is what everyone has as the, conflict, the inner conflict. Exactly the opposite happens. I valued connection over conflict. So if I didn't have the bandwidth to hold in neutrality while my son might push back on a boundary, I usually didn't set the boundary. So if I didn't have the bandwidth to have patience and neutrality, of course, a 3-year-old isn't going to always want to brush their teeth, or a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 15-year-old I have right now, or a grown adult. Sometimes I don't feel like getting up. I'm all cozy. I don't feel like getting up and going to brush my teeth. Now, as a grown adult, of course, I get up and do it. But we must be aware that sometimes the other person isn't going to want to do it. If I don't have the bandwidth and the patience to be present with my own boundary, then I would just not have him brush his teeth that night. Because I would rather have 4 nights out of 7 with this wonderful interaction, and he brushed his teeth 4 or 5 nights a week. Because what happens is that if the interactions are pleasant and connected and not fraught with conflict, then the relationship is connected. I have engendered this cooperation. I'll give you another example from, again, with my son, but please apply this even if you don't have children. Apply it to your spouse, apply it to your partner, apply it to a girlfriend, apply it to your boss. These relationships are everywhere. I just taught this Conscious Cleanse course, as many of you have been in with Dr. Shefali. It overflows into our relationship with food. So use it. I'm going to give you an example from my son. He's 15. So we just had Halloween. His curfew was 9:30. I was going to go pick him up from a friend's house at 9:30. He's 15. It happened that Halloween was a school night. So of course, at 9 o'clock, of course he texted me, Mom, can you come at 10 o'clock? Now he was pushing against my boundary. Now, am I going to be able to stay neutral inside? Am I going to be impatient? And am I going to feel disrespected? And am I going to feel put upon? Am I going to remain neutral? I just smiled. Of course, he's 15. He's going to ask for more time. Because in my life, if I'm with a girlfriend, sometimes I don't want my lunch to end and have to go back, to whatever I'm doing. So of course he did. So I texted him back, honey, I'm going to still be there at 9:30, as we said. It's a school night. So of course he texted back, how about 9:15? And I texted back, I'll be there at 9:30, still 9:30. It really had nothing to do with the boundary. It had to do with the place inside I was in holding the boundary. I was in a very neutral place. It could have gone south. I could have felt put upon. I could have felt disrespected. I could have felt a number of things. This way that we feel inside of ourselves, that is for ourself to take care of. So that when we are in the interaction where the boundary is concerned, we can stay in neutrality. The last example that I'm going to give you is one that everybody can relate to. It still happens to be about children, but again, use it, in your own life. Think of 3 different women and their children. They all have toddlers, and 3 different women, their toddlers all run out into the street, and they're each running out into traffic. So every one of us is going to agree that we would run after our child and keep them from harm's way. No one is going to let their child run into traffic. So we all agree on the boundary. We're going to set a limit. We're going to get our child out of harm's way. But those 3 women can have a different inner energy around the boundary. One woman will shame her child and say, I told you 1,000 times, don't run into traffic, and can belittle that child. Another mom will go, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're okay, and hug that child closer. A third mom might say, we don't run into the street. I'm so glad you're safe. Here, stay with me. The parent, the other individual, brings the energy in. So this example of seeing 3 different children running into traffic, but seeing 3 different energetic responses from the parent is what shows you that it is really our energy. We think it's about the other person's energy. We think it's about the child that, pulls back from us or keeps throwing the toys. Yes, but it's really about what happens inside of us when the other person isn't compliant. So when our toddler is not compliant, this is the time. Now we're going to move into the second part of setting a boundary. So I'm going to review. Remember, I said there's 2 parts in setting a boundary. One is to get inner clarity, and the second is to cultivate neutrality. How do you cultivate neutrality when the other person isn't compliant? Okay, so in the chat box right now, I want you to write what happens, what do you end up feeling when the other individual isn't compliant? You ask your spouse 1,000 times, will you please pick up your socks? You feel very justified. They're a grown adult. They can pick up their own clothes. What do you feel when you've asked and set a boundary and the other person isn't compliant? You ask your toddler, put down a toy. The toddler throws the toy at you. You ask your teen to sit down to have a chat with you, but they go into their room and close the door. What comes up within you when you set a boundary and the other individual is not compliant? What do you feel when they resist? So just write in the chat box. If you're watching this later on the replay, you write in your journal, what do you feel when the other individual isn't compliant? So if I ask my husband, please XYZ, and he doesn't comply with my boundary, what am I going to feel? A couple of you said this earlier. You fear that you're going to feel abandoned. You feel that you're going to be alone, end up being alone. So just write in the chat box what you feel when someone else doesn't respect your boundary. I have found in my own life that what I too can feel disrespected. I can fear that I'm going to be, alone, as someone else was saying, and I'm going to help you untangle. I'm going to use an example in my own life. My son is now in high school, and I was looking on the website to see his grades. So when he was in middle school, he had a 4.0. He graduated from middle school with a 4.0. Now he's a freshman in high school, and I was looking on the website, and I saw that he had many missing assignments in many different classes. And so this has been a challenge for him around procrastination, not really liking academic subjects, being unorganized, these kind of things. And so when I saw these missing assignments, I knew that I was going to set a boundary with him that weekend he was going to stay home and complete all of his assignments. Now, I knew that he was going to push back on that boundary, because what teenager is going to want to be told that all weekend they weren't leaving home? They were going to stay home until all of those assignments were complete. The first thing that I did before I set the boundary with my son. Now, I know some of you are going to be thinking you have to set boundaries with your toddlers in the moment. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But this is a boundary that I knew I was going to set. So I took the time to get clear first. What were my own concerns if he pushed back on my boundary, which I'm pretty sure all teenagers would. So I untangled it. And when I really sat with myself, what I really realized was that deepest down, I wanted really I guess the first surface level was I saw his grades and I knew I was a little attached to his grades because he had been making A's and now he had some B's and C's. So I realized first I was a little attached to his grades. When I let that go, underneath, I realized, I had a little bit of fear that if he doesn't keep that 4.0, it's going to affect him trying to get into a college. So then I realized that. When I dug a little deeper, I realized that a lot of it was really on me because I know that he can be disorganized. I know he has challenge. I know he procrastinates. I know he doesn't love his academics, but I hadn't really kept up with looking on the website because he had had this 4.0 and he had been doing well on his own. So I was partially upset with my own self and wanted to kind of blame him. But I was looking and taking my own responsibility, which I have always taken 100% responsibility for my reaction. And when I dug even deeper and I thought about having him stay in all weekend, what I really got down to was that I had this desire, this need inside of me for him to like me. So I wanted him to like me. So I didn't really want to be that mom that was going to put up a boundary because then he might not like me or he might, quote, abandon me. Do you understand that if I hadn't unpacked that, then the unconscious, unspoken energy that I would be bringing to my son would be take care of my feelings. Please don't abandon me. Please like me. Please be okay with this boundary. I need you to comply because I need you to like me. I need you to comply because I don't want to have conflict. These are my own unmet needs that I would be asking of the other person. We need to learn to take ownership of the ways that we unconsciously and unintentionally are asking the other person to meet our needs. I needed to get good with it's okay if he doesn't like me. That's not his job. His job is not to like me. My job is to like me. I had to get good inside with I'm here to be his advocate. And sometimes he's not going to like me. I needed to sort of grow myself up so that when I set the boundary for him, I was clean. I needed to look at what my own energy that I was going to be bringing into this boundary setting. And so I set the boundary and he did push back and I felt neutral. I actually felt good. I actually felt connected to that presence inside of me that is empowered, that felt neutral, but felt that this is something that I am doing for me. I'm doing it for me and me alone, because this is the mother that I am intending to bring forward for him. And you know what? He caught up on every last assignment. It doesn't matter to me if he would have been pushing back, resistant. I was able to stay in my own sovereign being. This is when you are going to elicit and engender cooperation. If I would have lost it, let's say, which we have done many times, all of us, I always practice 100% of the time. I always practice going back to him or my husband, my spouse, my friend, my coworker, a client. I always go back to the other individual and take 100% ownership and say, you know what? That is not my intention of the way I behaved. And when I take ownership of my own energy, it assists me to stay clean inside of myself. And I model to the other individual that we are here to connect. Even when I stumble and fumble and fall, I'm willing to take my own responsibility. When you can take your own responsibility around setting boundaries, You model to the other individual that no conflict is required. No battle is required. There's nothing that I need from the other individual when I am willing to take ownership of my own energy. So now I'm going to answer a couple of questions that people emailed me. One is about a situation with a spouse and a mother-in-law, and one is about a situation with a child, with 2 children. So the first one, I'm going to just read it out. Let's see here. Okay, so this one is from a mom who has 2 young children. So again, apply this to your own life. If you don't have children, or you're thinking of your spouse or a friend. This is from a mom with 2 toddlers. So I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to this masterclass on boundaries. It couldn't come at a better time. I'm struggling big time with setting boundaries, especially with my 2 young kids. Fear that I am punishing them as opposed to setting boundaries. The 2 things somehow blur for me, which causes deep unsettling and guilt within me. I'm desperately looking for real life, everyday examples of how to set boundaries with my children. Because I have more than one, this task seems so much harder, as now sibling rivalry is added into the mix, and I find myself yelling, threatening, and punishing my children in a desperate attempt to get them to stop. I just don't know how to set boundaries around this behavior. It's so confusing when I hear you and other teachers say that you don't punish your children, that you don't take things from them. My own guilt rises up. How can this be? On top of that, I'm struggling with expectation. How can I not have an expectation that my children will not hit me back, or hit each other for that matter? If I act on my expectation, am I just going against allowing them to be a free spirit? So I hope that you all can relate to this in some way, shape, or form, either with a spouse, a coworker, a boss, a friend, where we think that setting a boundary is going to end up punitive. So you can hear in her question all of the inner confusion that she has. So the first thing we need to do, now she is in a pattern, in a habit with the 3 of them. So the first thing that she's going to realize is that unraveling this pattern, it's not a one-time occurrence. Now she's in a pattern. So the first thing to realize is that when you're in a pattern, it's going to take time to unravel that pattern, and you need to be really committed that you're not going for the end result. You're going for the journey. You're going for your own unraveling, because if she unravels this in her own life, she will be free, and she will know how to set effective boundaries for the rest of her life. If she uses this as a process, not trying to get that result of those kids to stop hitting. The kids will stop hitting. This I promise you. But you can all see that she's adding to the unrest because of her own desperation, yelling, confusion, threats, punitive. So the first thing that all of us need to do is to sit back, and when you're not with your children, to sit, or when you're not with the other person, you need to sit and you need to go through what we just did, which was, what is my confusion? Where does it come from? Am I setting boundaries like I was set in my family of origin? Am I rebelling against it? Am I confused by what I'm hearing from the outside? We are so confused because we've been taught that boundaries are supposed to be punitive, and that it's an either or. Either I'm going to have these punitive boundaries, or my kids are going to have a free-for-all and they'll never learn not to hit, not to, be nice. This is erroneous, I'm telling you. So I hope that you can go back and gather wisdom from the examples that I used with my son, and use that wisdom to help you unravel the confusion that you are coming into it with. So you can see, if you're already coming into it confused about boundaries, they're going to be picking up on that confusion. So you need to get very clear. Even if it is punitive at first, even if what you can do clearly is say, put down that toy, or I'm going to take you into the other room. It doesn't matter. What matters first is that you are clear and you can carry out with clarity what you are intending. If not, wait until you can. The second thing is to always take a pause, whether it's with your spouse, whether it's with a coworker, and I'm just going to give you the languaging right now. I always said to my toddler, Mommy needs a minute. Mommy needs a minute. So if he was pulling on my shirt, I would say, Mommy needs a minute. I am confused right now. I need a minute to think about what to do in this moment. I would just tell him the truth. That's what's happening. That's what is going on. I need to figure this out. And what you will recognize is your spouse, your coworker, your friend, your toddler will actually respect. You're engendering respect. Oh, they're going to say, oh my gosh, my mom, this person who's supposed to know it all, needs a moment. This has been the cornerstone of boundary setting. If I'm not clear, I ask for a moment. I ask for what I need, and I take the time to work this out. And I might say that over the next month if I were this mom. I need a minute. I need a minute to figure this out. And I would spend time on, on my own time. I would spend that time on how do I come to clarity inside of myself. And this is what we're going to be talking about over my 4-week class. We're going to be really that question we are going to be dissecting over the 4 weeks so that you can feel empowered where your toddlers are concerned, or your spouse is concerned, or your mother-in-law is concerned. I'm going to do this one quick because we're running out of time here. And this is a mother-in-law husband question. So it says, Dear Susie, here's my question. My husband speaks English. However, sometimes with his mother, he speaks Spanish. And sometimes when it's the 3 of us eating a meal, they speak Spanish, knowing that I don't understand. It also happens on occasion with other family members of his, recently at a wedding. I feel disrespected and left out of the conversation. I did ask him and his mother if they could translate for me, but I was probably being passive aggressive. And I've asked him to speak English so that I could be included in the conversation. And I think he automatically does it without even the intention of hurting me. So it's an innocent intention. Now I'm working on my response, which in the past has been, I just start reading emails on my phone. But I'm really looking for a way to work this out for both of us. So this is a great example because she's very aware that she feels disrespected. She feels left out. Guarantee you this is from her family of origin. And she's needing them to include her so that she feels respected and included, which everyone would justify. Of course, it's rude. Why should they speak in Spanish? Everyone would justify that. But if you look underneath, there's a real neediness because she needs to ask herself, how did I feel disrespected when I was young? How did I feel not included? How do I disrespect myself in my current life? How do I disrespect myself? How do I, abandon my own self? When she begins to realize that she is here to meet those needs for herself and she doesn't have the neediness, I absolutely guarantee you she will have the same boundary, but she will engender the cooperation because with the boundary is not coming the neediness. And this is exactly what we're going to take over these 4 classes that I'm getting ready to teach. I want to tell you a little bit about the class and exactly what I'm going to teach you in this 4-week class because it takes a minute. As you can see, this is jam-packed. It takes a minute to unravel it all. First and foremost, I want you to know that in the class, you're going to learn to have a voice for yourself and have a voice that engenders cooperation rather than conflict. It's going to liberate all of your relationships. So in the first class, we're going to really dive deep into our own inner conflict and how to bring clarity when we set a boundary to anyone outside of us. We are going to learn how to create inner equanimity so that we don't have the inner neediness and we don't have the inner rebellion. We have that inner equanimity, that inner neutrality, so that when the other person pushes against our boundary, we have the bandwidth to stay inwardly connected and centered in our own sovereign being. Then we're going to learn how to, in the outer world, create and cultivate cooperation, engender cooperation rather than conflict, rather than battles. We're going to engender the cooperation. I'm going to teach you skills to engender that with all those around you. We're going to learn how to reconnect after a conflict. I've learned this with my son, and I've had some of the most beautiful moments with my son and with my husband, actually, when I have learned to effectively reconnect after a conflict. So important, a key ingredient that most of us are missing in life. We don't really know how to handle the inevitable conflicts that come up in life. In order to set an effective boundary, you need to feel empowered to connect after a conflict, or even how to participate and to be present when the other person is resisting and there's a conflict brewing. So I'm going to take you through step by step, because when you go through this step by step, you're going to end up transforming not only your inner relationship, but you're going to transform every outer relationship in your life. So I'm going to put right here, if I can, this is the link to sign up for the class. So, and right there at the top is the link to sign up for the class. 4 weeks deep dive into our own inner confusion to clarify that and then engender outer cooperation. So I look forward to seeing all of you in class. And in the meantime, I want you to write to me at susie@susielula.com. Any questions that you still have, watch this replay, watch it again, use your own examples in your own life, but email me as soon as you sign up for the class. You're going to be connected into a private Facebook page. So between now and when we start the class officially, you can ask questions there. If you sign up right now in the next 5 minutes, you'll go to that page. You can ask me questions. I'm going to be available to answer questions, to help you unravel the challenges, unravel the conflicts, and we can start even before the class starts officially. The class will start on November 20th, not this coming up Monday, but the following. So it'll give you time to rewatch this, to start working with some examples in your life, and to ask questions on the Facebook page. So see you all in the class. We'll end up conflict-free, battle-free, with cooperation and connection. See you all there. Thank you all so much. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Aw, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, taking your power back by finding your neutrality. Adrian signed up. Awesome. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, here's to conflict-free relationships. Oh, Swati's going to sign up. Great. Excellent. I look so forward to having you. I thought about you a couple of times because we both have teens. So I was thinking about you. Excellent. Looking forward to conflict-free relationships. Excellent, excellent. All right, you all. Yes, such powerful deconstruction. Yes. All right, everyone. See you in class. I can't wait. I literally can't wait. So watch the replay, sign up for class, go to the Facebook page, and I'll see you there.